But people who aren't Orthodox Christians, they're Greek Catholics, people whose historical legacy isn't in Moscow or Kiev or Rus, but where's the outrage? I know there's the activists out there, but where's the outrage where it counts? How's it moving the needle with the policymakers in Washington, D.C.? You're starting to see Europe come around. You're seeing Europe. I think today there was a letter from the French willing to pass over the background check, is that the United States has been controlling the shots, that we facilitated the rise of these people. We encouraged it because we felt that the black flag of Islam, the fact that the president is willing to talk to them, that the president wants peace, than to get caught up in the minutia of U.S. weapons shipments and all that kind of stuff. They understand that the whole politics of weapons shipments and intelligence providing is tangled up in policies that overlap, that Trump inherited a whole bunch of baggage that's almost impossible to disentangle from. So the Russians are real, which is why they won't allow a ceasefire, because as much as Rubio talks about more, as Rubio said, we can't make them, and nobody wants to give them up. So even though Rubio wants to get more patriots, they're not. And the Russians will continue their offensive in a Kiev that's increasingly defenseless, and the situation will get worse and worse for Ukraine. But I don't think we should get caught up in Marco Rubio asking for more Patriot missiles. That's common sense. It's not inconsistent with the policy vision of Trump. Trump is not asking Ukraine to roll over and play dead. Trump's asking both sides to stop fighting. But Trump, I don't think at this juncture, as long as Ukraine shows a willingness to consider the possibility of peace, Trump will continue to provide the ability to Ukraine to defend itself. If Ukraine shows that they have no desire for peace, that what they want to do is continue offensive operations, Trump, I think at that time will say, that's not what we're going to do. We're walking away. But I do agree with you that Rubio and Kellogg and others seem to be articulating very strongly from the perspective of the Ukrainians as opposed to the perspective of Trump. I think they confuse the fact that Trump is willing to consider continued assistance to Ukraine from a defensive perspective. I think they misconstrue that into Trump wants to continue to support Ukraine in general. And I don't think Trump wants to continue to support Ukraine in general. I think Trump wants Ukraine to bring an end to this war. This is why I'm not confident that there's going to be a peace agreement, because the reality of what Russia's demanding and what Ukraine is insisting on, we're completely different worlds. The Russians have been consistent about demilitarization. Demilitarization means that all Western weaponry are removed and the Ukrainian military is shrunk to around 50,000 men. Demilitarization means that Ukraine will never again be allowed to be used by the West as a proxy force to launch offensive attacks against Russia. Nobody in the West supports this. Nobody in the West supports this. And yet, there it is. Denazification. That means that the Zelensky regime is done, that the current Duma is done, that anything that has been touched politically by Banderist ideology or Ukrainian nationalism is done. And again, we have to reflect on the reality. Ukraine has undergone a dramatic demographic shift in the past couple years. Millions of Eastern Ukrainians who speak Russian have either taken Russian citizenship or fled Ukraine. What's left is a Ukraine that now is overrepresented by Western Ukrainians, by Lvov, by people who aren't Orthodox Christians. They're Greek Catholics, people whose historical legacy isn't in Moscow or Kiev or Rus, but in of those regions. And that's a completely different picture than what Putin's talking about right now. Even when the Russian negotiators stood up to the Ukrainians and said, when we come back, we'll be talking 8, not 4. He's talking Odessa, Mykolaiv, Dnipropetrovsk, the rest of Little Russia. Maybe they'll bring in a 9th one, Sumy, that the Russians are going to take to secure Kursk and Belgorod. But no Russians right now talking about going into Western Ukraine, into Lvov and Ivano-Frankivsk and all those other areas. No. But denazification would require Russian political and social control over those regions. This is why you can't ignore the fact that the head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, Rushkin, held a sort of a seminar earlier this year where they talked about Western Ukraine being given to the Poles, meaning that the best way to solve the problem of Western Ukrainian ultranationalism is to hand it off to the Poles and let them take care of it, knowing that the Poles have historical animosity towards Western Ukrainian nationalism as expressed by the ideology of Stepan Bandera. They remember the massacres of 1943, 1944, Berlin. But that now we're talking about the dismemberment of Ukraine. As we're speaking to dismemberment, understand what's going on with Hungary right now. There's moves afoot. The Hungarians are making moves to protect the Hungarian population in Carpathia. That could lead to annexation. And if you start, now I have to be honest, if I were in the Trump administration, in my position on the Ukraine-Russian conflict, I would be advocating for as many Patriot batteries as possible for Ukraine because it's defensive in nature. Because my job is to preserve life. And if I make things too easy for Russia at the negotiating table, then there's no pressure on Russia to concede anything. This war shouldn't be easy for Russia to win. And while I would not be talking about HIMARS and ATACMS and systems that are offensive in nature, I would definitely be talking about Patriot missiles and probably be talking about 155 millimeter artillery shells as well. Again, those battlefield support systems that are needed to suppress Russian attacks. I would be doing everything I could to discourage continued Russian offensive operations against Ukraine. I would be trying to say that it's not in anybody's interest to continue this war. It doesn't mean that I want Russians dead, but it also means that I'm not going to sit back and make it easier for Russia to kill Ukrainians. We have a moral responsibility. We started this war. We started this war, and it's our job now to bring this war to an end. But you don't do that by making Ukraine defenseless at all. And no, it should be a top priority of the United States to continue to enable Ukraine to defend its airspace and to enable Ukrainian units to defend themselves if they come under attack. That's just the way it is. To be honest, I can't speak for the Russians, but I would be surprised if any Russian sat there and was like, well, that's just ridiculous. I think all the Russians would go, yeah, that makes sense. But that's why we have a strategy to overcome their air defenses. And that's why we have new tactics and weapons on the battlefield to overcome that. And we will continue the attack. Okay, but at least the Russians have acknowledged now that they've had to do things, and those things come at a cost. And if the Russians make the decision to continue offensive operations, they'll pay a higher price. And that's a result of a decision made by the Russians, not a result of the Ukrainians attacking the Russians, but a decision by the Russians to continue offensive operations. And then as an American, my job would be to tell the Russians, do you really want to continue paying this cost? Why can't we find a way to bring this thing to an end? I don't think the Russians condemn Donald Trump for continuing to provide defensive weapons to the Ukrainians. I think they understand that's a reality. The Russians live in the real world. They don't live in the fantasy world. They don't live in a world where we wish everything was great and everything went the way we want it to go and all that. The Russians live in the hard, cold reality of life as it is. And this is why the Russians focus more on, only if you actually talk to the Russians, study the Russians, get into that. Like I said, the key to understanding the slow pace of the special military operation lies not in a critical analysis of the Russian general staff, but of the state council, of the Duma, of the governors, of the different economic bodies, because there's a whole bunch of economics tied into what's going on. And the economics is tied into diplomacy, the necessity of keeping open certain markets. It would become very difficult for Russia to keep Chinese and Indian markets open if it leveled Kiev, leveled Lvov, flattened Western Ukraine. And so Russia has to balance a whole bunch of things that normally a military person wouldn't be balancing. Back in Iraq, just bomb Iraq into the Stone Age, and we did our damnedest to do. Yeah, we didn't seek to violate laws of war and commit war crimes, but we took out power plants, we took out bridges, we took out factories, we took out everything that we felt was a legitimate target. There's no advocate for the Palestinian people anywhere in the West. There's no pressure put on Israel. The numbers are staggering. I warned about this. I may even warned about it on the show. I said there's going to be an exhaustion. Hamas gave 15 months of solid resistance. They almost won it. They're that close. But in the end, war it's unpredictable. Nasrallah got killed. Hezbollah collapsed. Assad collapsed. Axis of resistance went down. A ceasefire was brought in, disingenuous in its negotiation and implementation. led to false expectations of peace. And I said at the time, if Israel breaks the ceasefire, because everybody's like, oh, Israel, the world will rally around the. I said, no, they won't. The world's done with Palestine. We grew accustomed to dead Palestinians, and now we have a ceasefire. And when Israel starts killing Palestinians again, it's not going to be a reemergence of the daily outrage, because we are already conditioned to accept a certain amount of death and destruction. So all the Israelis, Galicia and Poland and Austro-Hungary, people who, as they developed a national identity, it was premised upon a deep hatred for all things. And this Western Ukrainian identity now is the dominant identity in Ukraine, and it's controlling everything. Nazification now means basically the termination of Ukraine as it's currently configured. Nobody in the West is talking about that as legitimate. And yet in Russia, there are plans for a denazi post-conflict Ukraine. How are those two? Stopping the fighting is the easiest part of this entire process. Even no NATO membership, I think everybody agrees that's an outcome. But in the EU thing, that's just, who cares? The bottom line is Ukraine will go where the victor tells it to go. And if Russia's the victor, that means Ukraine's orientation will be economically towards Russia, looking probably to be integrated into a union-type relationship similar to what Russia has with Belarus, except the Belarus-Russian relationship was based upon some notions of equality and respect. Putin respects Lukashenko. The Ukrainian-Russian relationship will at least start as a subordinate relationship on the part of Ukraine towards a dominant Russia. It may improve over time, but that's the reality. You don't get to that through negotiations. You can't get to that through negotiations. That can only happen when Russia crushes Ukraine and Ukraine has no other choice but to accept terms of surrender. But again, these terms are going to be very difficult. A lot of people aren't talking about the reality of Lvov in Western Ukraine, because Nazification would require Russia occupation and Russian dominance. And if you're not talking to them, if you're not having a constructive dialogue with them, if you don't even have the ability to interact with them, you're not accomplishing a damn thing. All you're doing is shouting to yourself. You might as well piss in the wind and call it rain, because that's all that's happening. So anyway, that's where I stand on that. I think the Palestinian people are ill-represented by everybody, including their supporters, because their supporters right now aren't saving a single frickin' life. All you demonstrators out there, you didn't do anything to stop the 137 people from being killed yesterday. And I don't know how many are going to be killed today, but you ain't stopping that. And there'll be more killed tomorrow and the day after and the day after, and your demonstrations aren't doing a goddamn thing. Let's be honest about this. Are you doing this so you can feel good about yourselves? So you can look yourself in the mirror and say, I'm out there demonstrating for the Palestinian people. They're dying. What are you doing to stop the deaths? And the only way to stop the deaths is to influence the people who are killing them. And the only way you can influence them is you actually have connectivity and dialogue with them. Nobody's trying to do that right now. He lives in a fantasy world. Yes, there's a Syrian national identity. And it was, first of all, Marco Rubio has to understand that Syria is a fake nation. You do know that, Marco, right? You knew that Syria was made by the French in the aftermath of the First World War, a mandate given to them by the League of Nations. And they just arbitrarily drew lines on a map, especially the line up north. It sort of irritated a lot of Turks who feel that Aleppo and Idlib are part of Turkey. That's why Turkey fought that off. The Romanians may come in and start securing areas that belong to them as well. We could be looking at the dismemberment of Ukraine. Nobody's talking about that today. But that's a realistic outcome. So these negotiations right now, I think right now there's a bunch of theater, a bunch of posturing, because they're not addressing, as what the Russians call, the root cause of this conflict. And once the Russians start to get very specific about the root cause as they see it, nobody in the West is going to be satisfied with the prescriptions that Russia is writing. Part of the problem here is that the Western Ukrainians have some very high-profile advocates advocating for their position to the United States, Europe, NATO, even many Americans, Lindsey Graham and others. And so this serves, it also in some ways serves as a deterrent to Russia. You don't want to give these political forces more ammunition to mobilize against Russia. So you temper. Oh yeah, I have to tell you, I can't speak for the Russian general staff. I don't know. I can't They know what their goals and objectives are and the pace of operations, etc. But having planned or helped plan and implement a strategic air campaign, I was just a captain, so I'm not one of the colonels up there making the big decisions, but I was an observer. I'm a pretty damn good observer. So I observed the totality of the thought process that went into the creation of the strategic air campaign against Iraq. And then I was there intimately following it being executed. I know what it takes to break a nation. And Russia's not trying to break Ukraine. It's a very frustrating thing as a military analyst because my analytical models are predicated upon purely militaristic approaches. Russia has a whole bunch of politics woven into there. And it's Russian unique politics, meaning that it's difficult for a Westerner to understand them at first blush. Assad couldn't. He didn't cut off American heads. Jelani did, and you're standing next to him. This is hypocrisy in the extreme. I'd have some interesting questions for Marco Rubio. How can you lift sanctions against the new transitional authority until you've resolved the issue of Syrian chemical weapons? You forgot about those, did you? You do remember 2018, your president, Donald Trump, ordered a major airstrike against Syria based upon intelligence that stated unequivocally that Syria retained active offensive chemical weapons capability to include production facilities that produced the chemical weapons that went on an airplane that were used against Shashikun or something. I might mispronounce the name. Now, I said it was a fake. Everybody who knows anything about chemical weapons said it, but the Trump administration went on record saying it's real based upon intelligence, and sanctions were passed. The Caesar sanctions were passed because of supposed photographs that show allegations of the Syrian government killing people, massive human rights. Hell, we don't have to call it the Caesar sanctions. What about the Alawite sanctions? The videotapes of the Alawites crawling on the ground being made to bark before they're executed summarily by Jelani's people, or the Christians that are raped and murdered, the Druze that are being attacked on a daily basis. There is no Syrian national identity today in Jelani's Syria. It is a caliphate. End of story. These are the worst people in the world. Why you would ever shake their hand, I don't understand. And if you want stability in Syria, you need to slaughter these Islamists and replace them with people. What we're going to do is bring us back up to the level that we already accepted. And this is what's happening. 137 civilians killed yesterday in a bombing attack. Where's the outrage? I know there's the activists out there, but where's the outrage where it counts? How's it moving the needle with the policymakers in Washington, D.C.? You're starting to see Europe come around. You're seeing Europe. I think today there was a letter from the French, the Belgians, and the Canadians condemning this. But when is the European Union can come out and stop selling weapons? France is talking about, but they haven't done it. Last time Macron made a mention of it, Netanyahu threatened to shut down whatever magic connectivity Israel has with France, and Macron immediately backed off. Nobody's shown the courage to step up to the Israelis. Why they commit genocide openly in our face. Yes, we have people here. Ray McGovern, again, I talked to him yesterday. He is very emotional when it comes to Gaza. But Ray knows I feel this way, and I'll just say it. It's not a bad thing on Ray, but nobody in the Trump administration cares how emotional Ray McGovern gets, or how Code Pink gets, or how any Palestinian, pro-Palestinian group gets. They have no connectivity with the government, which is one of their fatal mistakes, is that they've spent so much time protesting the government that they have no ability to put pressure on the government. And this is why I recommended yesterday that maybe Ray and others look at creating a forum of connectivity to engage in constructive dialogue, looking for solutions, not just identifying transgressions. It's very easy and morally correct, by the way, to stand up and condemn the Gaza genocide, but not a damn thing's happening from it. You're not changing policy. You're not affecting policy. And continued demonstrations will only further entrench both sides. Some effort's going to have to be made to get that connectivity in there. You have to hold your nose on some things, but it's more important to talk constructively than it is to shout at each other across barricades at this juncture, because I have to ask, how are you helping the Palestinian people, the people of Gaza, by continuing protests? Your protests are getting nowhere, not in the United States. But here's another question. Who are your potential allies in the Trump administration? And what effort have you made to reach out to them to begin a dialogue, so that when a question is asked, you're there with the answer. You say, hey, and they trust you. I got really slammed hard for engaging in a dialogue with Alan Dershowitz. I was slammed all over the place. People were just, you shouldn't talk to him and all that. I won't say the word, but it begins with an F and it sounds suck. Willing to live in peace collectively. and a nation that tolerates religious differences. Jolani doesn't tolerate religious difference. He slaughters you if you don't buy into the Salafist, Wahhabist principles of his head-chopping colleagues, many of whom aren't Syrian to begin with. You know, the Uyghurs, the Uzbeks, the Chechens, the Turkmen, the various nationalities that have come together, brought together by the Turks and by the United States. One of the reasons why Rubio is so willing to pass over the background check is that the United States has been controlling the shots, that we facilitated the rise of these people. We encouraged it because we felt that the black flag of Islam would put a lot of pressure on the national umbrella of Assad. So we encourage this kind of stuff. The hypocrisy that's contained in Rubio's statement and the ignorance contained in it is extreme. Why the United States would ever do business with Jolani is beyond me. We should be seeking his demise. We should be encouraging people to collect the $10 million reward. A bullet should put in his head. Instead, he's standing next to the United States, President of the United States, and he's going to get rewarded for killing Americans by the lifting of sanctions. So hard for Hataya. Everybody says Hataya province is an Arab province. From the Turkish perspective, it's a Turkish province because it's not about the population. It's about the psychology, the culture, etc. There is no Syrian national identity. To the extent that Syria has a national identity, it was created by the Baaths who took over and put that umbrella out there that brought people together. You can call the Assad's butchers. Certainly you can. But my God, what is Jolani? And didn't pass a background check? You stupid son of a bitch. They're terrorists. He cuts off heads. He killed Americans. I guess Rubio doesn't care about that, huh? It's okay that Jolani and his ilk were fighting Americans in Iraq in 2003 to 2006 before he got captured by the United States. And he was held by the United States for a number of years before they released him. And then for a man who was supposed to be a low-level guy, almost immediately al-Zawahiri, the al-Qaeda head deputy at that time, sent him into Syria to create the Islamic rising up against the Syrian national identity. Rubio's so full of it right there. It's just unbelievable how utterly ignorant everything he said was there. If you're interested in the stability of Syria, why didn't you support Assad? Could Assad not have passed a background check? Is that the problem? You, anybody who's against that. Because Alan Dershowitz does have the ear of the administration and the ear of people. Imagine if you could actually sit down and have a constructive dialogue with Alan Dershowitz and cut through the emotions, the attacks. And maybe you can't solve everything because you can't solve everything, but find one or two things that you agree upon and then begin a dialogue on that so you get connectivity so that maybe when that problem comes up, Alan Dershowitz says, Scott Ritter had a good idea. Hey, Scott, why don't you come in and sit down and talk to the people about this idea? And now you have a conversation and then bam, one little aspect of life in Gaza gets better because of that. And then you build upon that success. And who knows where it will go. But today, there's no connectivity. We talk about Western Ukraine and the dichotomy, the differences between how the West treats Western Ukraine, how Russia treats Western Ukraine, and how the West treats the people of Gaza and how Israel treats. And the reason is there are no advocates for the Palestinian people that count. The people call themselves advocate, but who are you advocating to? If you're preaching to the choir, you ain't accomplishing a damn thing. You got to bring the sinners in, baby. You got to preach to the sinners. And the sinners right now is the Trump administration, everybody in Congress who facilitates the genocide.